Yeah, I'll start. Okay, good. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second week of Events Week, Identity Defined, organised by us here at the Alba Christian Union, where each evening we will be exploring a different aspect of our identity and what the Bible has to say about it. My name is Dixie. I'm a first-year history student here in Alba and part of the CU, and I will be hosting this evening. And Tonight I'm joined by Phil Swann, who will be giving us a talk titled Defined by My Wellbeing. How much does my mental health change who I am? Good evening, Phil. How are you? Do you want to just introduce yourself for us a little bit?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dixie. My name is Phil Swann. I'm a pastor of a church in Llanelli, the best part of Wales, next to Aberystwyth, of course.
Nice. That's great. Thank you. Before I pass on to Phil to let him start speaking, in the comments, I believe there'll be a link where you can ask anonymous questions as Phil is speaking that we will answer after the talk, Q&A session. So just click on that link and you can ask your questions as Phil is speaking. But I think that's everything I have to say, so I'll pass it over to you, Phil.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dixie. I must say it's one of the longest titles I've ever been given to speak on. So what I'm actually going to do is probably take the first part, which is defined by my well-being. I want to start by saying a little bit about who I am so that you get a bigger background and know where I'm coming from. I like to start these talks by saying that I first stepped inside a psychiatric hospital in 1983. And the reason I was there was I was a student physiotherapist at the time. I was training in Cardiff, and we were all taken to the local psychiatric hospital in Cardiff, Whitchurch Hospital, to have a little look around and to have a lecture. And I remember being very fearful at the time, but at the same time quite intrigued. And so when I qualified as a chartered physio, working in Cardiff, I was fortunate that my first placement as a newly qualified physio was actually in Whitchurch Hospital, where I discovered that it was a centre of excellence for physiotherapy in psychiatry in the UK. And so I decided that this would be a great place to sort of build my career on. So I worked in the NHS up until 1990, specialising in psychiatry. So I worked with things like forensic psychiatry, people who commit crimes as a result of mental illness, an interesting role there. I worked with some addictions unit issues, general psychiatry stuff, but my real area of interest was stress management. So I set up and ran a stress management clinic in the Heath Hospital in Wales. But in 1990, I was called into Christian ministry, and I've kind of kept up my interest, but it's been there in the background. So I'm speaking to you tonight as, if you like, almost as somebody who once was a professional working in mental health, but I have not worked in that area professionally for a very long time. I've maintained my interest, though, as a Christian minister. So that's really my, if you like, my parameters for tonight. It's very interesting that I kind of did most of my growing up, although I like to think I haven't entirely still grown up, but I did most of my growing up in the 1970s. They were my formative years. And that was a pretty rough time for people who struggled with their mental health. It wasn't at all uncommon to find people who maybe were having difficulties with things like depression or something like that. They would be written off in some ways, particularly by the older generation at that time, as somehow lacking moral fibre, was the phrase. That somehow having a mental health issue was a reflection on your character. It was a result of being weak or something like that. And in popular culture at the time, there was terrific mockery towards people who had serious mental health issues. It wasn't uncommon to hear things which we would be really offended by today in regular conversation. So people would talk about somebody going to the loony bin or being a nutter or crazy or something like that. And these are phrases we would rarely apply. I hope we wouldn't apply at all, actually, to people who are suffering from real mental illness today. But back then, That was the attitude. There was a lot of fear about mental illness. Often the idea was if somebody had a mental illness, they would be dangerous, both to themselves and more importantly to society. And that kind of fear as well was there. And so mental illness was very much the way in which people, well, let me rephrase that. The emphasis was on mental illness in society, not what we have today, which is actually much more positive, and on mental health. So for example, tonight you've asked me to speak about defined by my well-being. By and large, that would not have been a concept when I was growing up. Everything was on the dark side, the heavy side of mental illness, and by and large not handled well. And of course there was terrific stigma associated with it. Now of course you probably realize today there still is a problem with stigma in the area of mental health, mental illness, but of course we are a lot further along the line of making progress in this area. Now I want to talk to you about some of these issues tonight. As a Christian, I'm going to begin by speaking very generally about mental health rather than mental illness. If you want to pick up with me in the question time afterwards about more specific issues of mental illness, I'm happy to talk about those. But my emphasis this evening is really on maintaining good mental health. And what I'm going to do after a kind of general introduction to this is try and look at this as I would see it as a Christian. And I want to tell you some of the distinct advantages, I think, of being a Christian has on good mental health. To sort of back this up, I remember reading in a book, a fascinating book called Is Faith Delusional? And it was written by Professor Andrew Sims, who's the former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, also happens to be a Christian. And in that book, he says, after many, many years of research, he came to this conclusion. I'm quoting now from his book. The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on mental and physical health is one of the best kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. It's a very interesting phrase. He's arguing there what really I'm going to try and put to you tonight, that within the Christian hope are many things that actually are profoundly good for us in terms of our mental health. Now, as I said, I was going to start talking generally about mental health, and I want to do that now. We all struggle, if we be fair about it tonight, we all struggle to one degree or another with certain aspects of our mental health. Now, there are currently, right now, the situation that we're in globally and nationally with the COVID-19 pandemic, it is a bit of a threat to maintaining good mental health today. And you know about that, I'm sure, particularly as students. There's been an awful lot in the press showing the huge pressures and very real stress that many of you have had to operate under. There's all the business of the uncertainty of the new normal. What does this mean for you and your future after you finish your degree? What does this mean for you in terms of your career path? What kind of world are we emerging out of the COVID-19 restrictions into? All of these things pose serious questions which can challenge, if you like, our balance, our equilibrium in terms of our mental health. And then there's the really big one, which is the one that probably has challenged you most of all during the periods of lockdown, and it's the whole issue of being disconnected from your friends. We're connecting tonight on Zoom, on Facebook. Things like that are a help, but it's nowhere near like the real thing. There's the loss of community, there's the removal of the familiar, and there is the prospect of very real social isolation, which can lead to loneliness. There's been a lot of studies done now which are showing that loneliness has a very serious effect on us mentally and on us psychologically. Now, on top of this as well, we face other pressures today. They're the pressures of social media, the whole business of information overload, the damage now, it seems, that listening to the news regularly throughout the day with all the information about statistics and research and what's going on in different parts of the world, all of this can have a very damaging effect or a challenging effect on maintaining good mental health. And then you factor in the whole business of fake news and conspiracy theories. There are all sorts of pressures which are on us at this time, and nobody, it seems to me, is exempt from this, irrespective of whether you're a student at Abbey University or not. Everyone is, to one degree or another, struggling with this. Now, there's often an assumption that if we go through an experience, we face an experience like this, it is going to do us harm. That's the assumption. It's fascinating to hear people talk about something that comes their way that is challenging, maybe gets them down a bit, maybe fills them with a certain measure of anxiety, who immediately assumes that that is bad for my mental health. This isn't good for my mental health has been perhaps one of the most commonly repeated phrases during this pandemic virus situation that we're in. But it's interesting to note that sometimes good things for our mental health can come out of adverse experiences. And maybe just as a general point tonight, please take this one away, that just because you face something hard and difficult and taxing to your mental health, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. You've probably heard of the term PTSD. I've done quite a bit of work with trauma, particularly through my work as a minister, as sadly sometimes people come to me who've had really, really distressing life experiences. And so you'll have heard of a thing called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And you may not have heard of post-traumatic growth disorder. Post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is what takes place when someone has gone through an extremely traumatic experience, but that has actually led them to reevaluate their life, their values, what is important for them. And although the experience was very negative when it happened, they actually emerge out the other side the better for it. One of the classic areas of this, you see it in servicemen and servicewomen who maybe have had conflict experiences which were really distressing. They come back to the UK and they say sometimes, it's made me reevaluate my life. I see now in life what are the things that really matter. And actually, in the long run, this has been a positive thing for me. So please don't think that adverse experiences that trouble our mental health or trouble our sense of mental health are necessarily always bad for us. And of course, there are many helps available today. There's so much more available online about maintaining good mental health. You will probably know already far more about this than the average person in the street knew 10 years ago. There is so much helpful information out there. And a lot of things we find really helpful for maintaining good mental health are actually things that we have discovered ourselves. They're the best ones. So for example, we've probably all discovered the value of getting a good night's sleep or maintaining rest in the middle of a busy day, the importance of rebalancing the system. All of that is really important to maintaining good mental health. And probably you've known the flip side of knowing when you don't get good sleep, how damaging that can be on things like concentration and just the way your mind processes things cognitively. You're probably aware of the benefit of exercise and movement. Being cooped up all the time in your house, staring at a screen is really not good for you in the long run. You've got to get out there, move, raise your heart rate, get your lungs working harder. All of this is really good for your general sense of well-being and is part of the balance which we need. And as a Christian, I would say is part of the way God has designed us. He's actually designed, particularly you as young people, for your heart and your lungs to be put under a strain, put under pressure. You feel better for it. He's designed certain things to happen in terms of your body's chemistry, which will promote that. So exercise is really important and great for maintaining good mental health. There's the value of a creative outlook, of being able to express yourself, maybe in a poetry or painting or singing or photography or whatever it is. That one is often overlooked, but it's really important. Even learning a new skill can provide a helpful creative outlook that's good for mental health. But the really big ones, aren't there, are things like, and we don't fully understand this, but something extraordinary happens. We might even call it mysterious when we find internal pressures and problems in terms of our mental well-being, and we talk to someone about it. And we find someone who's willing to listen and really seems to take an interest in us and really seems to care. That sense of being validated has a huge positive effect on us, as well as things like, of course, the importance of relationships, the security of knowing, or the comfort of knowing that you're acknowledged by another human being, that you're understood, and best of all, loved. That sort of thing is so healthy to us in terms of good mental health. I want to move this on a little bit now to begin to introduce how we might start to look at this. We might say Christianly. How do we look at mental health from a Christian perspective? Well, the first thing I want to say is actually Christians are not immune from mental illnesses. I know I said I wouldn't talk much about mental illness, and I'm not going to, but I want to flag that right up at the beginning, that just because someone's a Christian, it doesn't mean that somehow they've got everything sorted, and in terms of their mental well-being, everything is perfect. In fact, there are whole areas of the Bible where we find people calling out to God out of real mental anguish. Something is going on in their context which fills them with real anxiety, real concerns. But of course, the great thing about a Christian who does suffer in this way is that they have the comfort of being able to take these things to God, and the comfort of the Christian faith. And I'm going to explore that in a few moments. But before we do that, again, just speaking generally about thinking about this subject Christianly, there is terrific value in maintaining good mental health, in being clear about who you are. This whole issue of identity. It's a dreadful thing to not really know who you are, or your place in the universe, or where you fit in with a world, which even right now might appear to look a very frightening place. And one of the great things about the Christian message is it provides us with a whole load of things which address the issue of our identity, which are very good for our mental health. Now, years and years ago, early psychotherapists discovered that the value and the importance of somebody's worldview, that the way in which somebody understood the world, the way in which they understood themselves and their place in the world, was often central to the whole process of helping someone overcome mental distress. Worldview really matters. And I want to ask you a question now, just a general challenge in your own mind. Have you ever sat and thought carefully what your worldview is? What is your view of the world and your place in it? A lot of people just kind of drift through from one set of exams to another set of exams, one relationship to another, one experience with entertainment to another, without really thinking about that. But worldview is so really important. And if I could make an observation on folks today, is that many people's worldview kind of rests on, and it's their sense of identity, rests on the things that they feel inside rather than objective things which are outside of them. And that actually is a real shift in our culture. If you went back 20, 30 years ago, people would often use external things in culture to work out who they were. So the classic example would be, am I a man or a woman? Am I in a relationship or not? I'm a son or a daughter, or a wife or a husband, or a girlfriend or a boyfriend? These would be external relationship markers which would help them understand who they were. And then eventually you get a career and you say, well, you know, I'm a teacher, or I'm a policeman, I'm an office worker, or I'm a shipbuilder, or whatever it is. It provided people with a sense of identity But people looked outside for that. Today, we look inside. It's who I feel I am, who I feel that I want to be. And I actually think that in the long run, that's not particularly great for our mental health, because what it's saying is that our understanding of who we are in terms of the whole big wide world relies on the resources that we have inside of us. And that puts a huge strain on us, which is why often we look for everyone to affirm whatever we're feeling about ourselves to sort of back that up. Now, the really big thing I wanted to say to you tonight was to talk about the fact that as you navigate through life, we all know life isn't, to use the old cliche, it isn't a bed of roses. There will be many problems which, when you hit them, they will challenge your sense of well-being and your mental health. So, for example, there will be relationship difficulties. Maybe friendships get strained, you break up with someone, that can cause huge pressure. And then there's the whole area of failed expectations. You might have all sorts of things planned out, how you see your life going, and then all of a sudden, it doesn't work out like that. You don't get the career which you want, or there may be issues with your health or in the health of others who you love. And if we factor in things like your upbringing, if maybe you've been brought up in a home or in a context which has been less than ideal, with a lot of tension and a lot of difficulties and a lot of problems, well, very soon we can find ourselves realizing that the lives that we're living in the world in which we're living is not a straightforward business. Now, Mike, the issue is that at times when we hit difficulties in life, we all need certain points of reference, if you like, to navigate through life. Where I live in Llanelli down in South Wales, we're right on the coast. And not far from here, there's a part of the coastline which was at one time quite notorious for wreckers. And this is going back many, many years. Those of you who love history like Dixie, you get these situations where people would knock out the proper lighthouse, and then they would set up counterfeit lighthouses. And the idea was to entice ships onto rocks where they would be wrecked. And then the locals would go out, and there's some pretty dreadful stories told of what they did to survivors who didn't remain survivors for very long, sadly, as they basically carted off the cargo. Now, what was happening there was that false lights were operating as false points of reference in a storm. And you and I have to be really careful that we have really good, secure points of reference to navigate through in life. Now, as a Christian, I believe we have a tremendous set of points of reference in life. And I want to take you through a few of these. I think they're absolutely wonderful and a great comfort to the Christian as they experience difficulties in life. Probably the first of these is that the Christian actually understands who they are. Not perfectly, of course, but they understand themselves through the lens, if you like, of what the Bible teaches. And one of the most fundamental thing the Bible teaches about us as human beings is that we're different to the rest of creation, not simply because we've got a bigger brain, but because we've been made in the image and the likeness of God. Now, whatever you think about the creation account, something is being said there which is distinguishing us as human beings from all the other creatures, made in the image and likeness of God. And if you're new to all of this, you might say, what on earth does that mean? And what does that mean for me? Well, I think it sort of transfers in this sort of way. We've been designed originally for relationship, and particularly for relationship with God. Now, the tragedy is the Bible goes on very quickly to show us that that relationship has been cut off. We've lost it. Theologians speak about the fall. It's a fall away from a place where we literally could walk and talk with God in the most intimate, natural way to a place where, or where is he? And it sort of left us hanging as human beings with this sense that there should be more to life than this. And so we look for the more in all sorts of places. We look for it often in the extremes of sex and drugs and entertainment, the thrills and the spills of life, looking for that sort of transcendental experience, but unable to find it. Now, the Christian realizes that the reason we're on this kind of treadmill in life, looking for emotional satisfaction and inward satisfaction, the inward longings that we have, is because we've been made in the image and likeness of God, but something has gone wrong. Now, you might say right now, that sounds a bit depressing. And it is, but that actually is the Bible's starting point. But it moves us very rapidly to a place of hope, which is the news that God is fully aware of this, of course, and that he's responded to us in this. And his response isn't to say to us, well, somehow you've got to piece your life together under your own steam. Somehow you've got to think through all your problems all of the time, or try and behave in such a way that you can somehow get this sense of disconnection in your life under control. He doesn't say that to us. Perhaps the most shocking thing that we see in the Bible is that God says to us, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to come to you as one of you, fully human, knowing all the restrictions of what it means to be a human being. And I'm going to come to you to bring life and to bring satisfaction. And so the Christian knows there is always hope. And that within that hope, which is focused in Jesus Christ, and I'm going to say a little bit more about him in a moment because he's really the central issue here, the Christian knows that accompanying that hope is great compassion and love. You know, one of the greatest things you can experience in life is to know that someone loves you and that they really love you. And, you know, as wonderful as that love may be, maybe it's the love of a parent or a partner, and as wonderful as that love is, that love, you know, is never, that love is always conditional. They've got to know you, or you are their child. There's always a condition to start with. The Bible tells us that God of us is actually unconditional, that he has loved us long before we've loved him or moved towards him, and that he's loved us even at a time when we were rejecting him and even hating him. So Christians have these points of reference in life. They know they're loved unconditionally. They know who they are, that they've been designed for relationship with God. And they also recognize that the world is a messed up place because of the fall. Which brings me really to pretty much, I guess, in many ways, the last thing that I want to say, which is I want to talk to you in conclusion about Jesus, who has been described as the sanest person who ever lived. And I think that's a great thing for us to look at the end this evening on this talk about mental health. The Bible presents to us the person of Jesus as the one who is the ultimate expression of God's love, the one who is able to bring to you and to me the fulfillment, the spiritual fulfillment that we're longing for. And he is the one who ultimately is able to defeat all of the darkness in our world. In other words, it all hangs on Jesus. Now, if you look at the life of Jesus Christ, it's a fascinating life. The Bible makes it clear that he comes to us absolutely, perfectly, 100% human. And yet at the same time, he is all the time God. Now, that is a mystery, but it's a wonderful mystery. And if you accept that straight away, you have a very rational reason for things like the miracles. It makes perfect sense that if Jesus of Nazareth is also God, that he can walk on water, turn water into wine, heal the sick and raise the dead. That just seems incredibly consistent with the claim that he is God. But in terms of looking at mental health issues, it's Jesus's humanity that becomes so compelling. He is not presented to us as a kind of plaster saint, someone who hovers 4 inches off the ground and never got his feet dirty, or there was never a crease in his clothes. Instead, he's presented to us as somebody who experiences many of the negative things we can experience in our mental health. So Jesus experiences anxiety. Jesus experiences times when he is low in spirit. He experiences times of great weariness, and he experiences grief. He doesn't, for example, suppress expressing those emotions. So we find him weeping at the funeral of a friend. We find him in other occasions expressing himself emotionally. And of course, the really big thing you see with Jesus is that he speaks so powerfully and positively about the importance of relationship, of not being isolated. Now, this all comes together, this understanding of Jesus, who is, I honestly think, the sanest person who has ever walked the face of this planet, is that he has come into this world to do us good. And the good that he seeks to do is not some abstract theological good, but it's something that touches the whole of us as a person. There's a lovely story told in one of the Gospels about a man who was clearly in major, serious, acute, plus mental distress. So much so everyone is terrified of him. And he's an outcast. He's made his home in a graveyard. He would regularly self-harm. He is in a dreadful, desperate situation. Everyone's terrified of him. And Jesus speaks into this man's life and he heals him. And there's a wonderful way in which the Bible puts this, that this man was clothed and in his right mind. He used to run around naked. So he's now clothed and in his right mind, sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to his ministry. Something powerful happened that affected the whole of that man. Not only was the power of sin broken in his life, but in doing so, it affected his mental well-being positively. Now you see, Jesus came into our world, and you might say he entered our madness. He entered the insanity of the human race, with all of its injustice and its exploitation, with all of the awful things that we're capable of. He entered into that. Just a short while after he was born, the local Roman governor set about wanting to have him slaughtered. Many people chased him through life, trying to murder him. Ultimately, he was betrayed by one of his closest friends and crucified by the Romans in Jerusalem. He experienced the madness of humanity in the most extreme ways that humanity can show it. But Jesus comes not just simply to say, hey, I know all about this. I know all about the suffering. I know all about the difficulties that you experience with your mental health. He didn't come just to do that, though of course he does understand. The Bible makes it really clear that he came to deal with the root problem behind all of the chaos in the world, and the root problem ultimately behind all of our mental distress. And that is the problem of sin. Sin was the energy in the fall that has cut us off from enjoying the God who has made us. And sin is the power behind all the darkness in our world. Sin is ultimately the great stress and anxiety generator. And it is in his death on the cross that Jesus takes on the power of sin in a way in which you and I cannot take it on. And on the cross, he dies. We know that. But he dies so that the power of sin might be broken. Now, how can we be confident that Jesus has done this? Well, the Bible simply tells us that on the morning of the third day, he rose from the dead. People weren't expecting that. It came as a terrific shock to his disciples, who were in the grip of great mental despair and anguish. But into that anguish he speaks. There's a wonderful moment. The very first person to know that Jesus had been raised from the dead was a woman, and her name was Mary. And she was at the place where they put Jesus in the tomb, and she wasn't expecting to find him raised from the dead. She'd gone there to finish the business of embalming his body. And she sees this chap who she thinks is the gardener in the cemetery. And she's puzzled by the fact that Jesus's body is missing, and she can't put the pieces together. So she says to this chap who she thinks is the gardener, well, listen, if you know what they've done with his body, please tell me. It's a terrible thing. And we read that Jesus turned and simply called her name, Mary. And with that, not only Mary's world was turned, I like to think, the right way up, but hope has come into our world for you and for me. Now, please don't think that I'm saying here tonight that if you become a Christian, all of your mental health issues will be taken care of, that suddenly you'll have no anxiety or no stress. But what I am saying to you tonight is that in this highly uncertain, unpredictable world, in which there are problems outside and problems inside of you, in Jesus Christ, here is one who understands you better than you know yourself and has dealt with the root of the problem in the whole of the world. And the root, the thing that is at the root, the foundational problem of all of your problems. And he loves you. And he says, I get you, I know you, I understand what it is to be human. And if you put your faith and trust in me, I will give you life. And I promise never to leave you. And I'll never forsake you. And I will never stop loving you. And we're back to these points of reference in life. These are massive. Back in the summer, my wife and I tried to take a holiday. It's so difficult, knowing we ended up in an Airbnb place in Yorkshire. It was great. A retired police inspector, fascinating bloke, because he'd done a sort of, as a hobby, an interest in the writings of Carl Jung. And so my holiday rapidly disappeared, as he loved to discuss these things at great length into the small hours. But he turned to me one night, he said, "You're a Christian." He said, "Well, tell me," he said, "what is the biggest thing about being a Christian? What's the biggest takeaway for you?" It's a fantastic question. And I must be honest, I really had to think, if I had to choose one thing, what would it be? And I said to him, to me, the best thing is that because of what Jesus has done and my faith in him, I know that whatever happens in life, wherever I go, however challenging it is, however difficult, however taxing and dark it may be, everything is always all right between me and God. And that's phenomenal. You know, you can fail your exams. I failed my first year. I know what that was like. And you feel like it's the end of the world. You can have failed relationships. I've had those. They're deeply, deeply painful. You can have health failures. But to know all the time in the midst of all those things that there is this massive point of reference that will not fail you, that everything is all right between you and God. I do think that Andrew Sims, former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, is absolutely right. The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on mental and physical health is one of the best kept secrets of psychiatry and medicine generally. One of the loveliest things, I really will close with this, is that Jesus often spoke, to people who were experiencing mental distress. So in that famous sermon, he once preached a sermon, it's known as the Sermon on the Mount. He says to people in there, don't worry about your life, what you should eat or drink, or about the body, or what you should wear. And you say, oh, thanks a lot. I'd love not to be able to worry. Is it really as simple as that? Well, Jesus goes on to tell us why we shouldn't worry. He says, is your life not more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? We all agree with that. And then he says this, look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? And he's inviting us to see how precious human beings are in God's eyes and how deeply loved. And that point will have its fullest expression in the offering of his own life for us on the cross so that we might have life. Well, I think I'll wind up there, Dixie, if that's all right.
That was very, very good, Phil. It was really good.
Thank you
very much. I was very disappointed when it came to an end. Praise God that everything is all right between us and him. That's amazing. Thank you. We have got some questions for you. Our first one is, in lockdown, how can we control loneliness?
It's a really good question, isn't it? And it's something I think it's helpful to recognize that we all battle with this one. So, it's funny. I've met people during lockdown. They say, oh, I hate Zoom. I don't like Zoom, as if somehow they're unique. We all struggle with this. And knowing that we all struggle is helpful. But overcoming it practically, well, I think we've just got to work a lot harder at relationships and friendships. So it's good to have a list of people who you don't necessarily assume you're going to be in contact with them, but make sure you apply yourself and actually reach out to them. I think some of the loneliest people during lockdown are people who think that the world somehow should be reaching out to them. We've all got to make that effort. So make an effort every day to reach out to different people, whether on your phone. I think the phone's interesting, isn't it? Texting is okay, and all, WhatsApp is okay, but it's lovely to hear the sound of someone's voice. And wouldn't it make a difference to one another's mental health if when we rang someone, the first thing we said was, how are you? What kind of day are you having? And learn then to keep our mouths shut and to give that person space to talk. Being listened to is really important. And then probably, hopefully, as the conversation goes on, they'll ask how you are, and you can talk as well. So overcoming loneliness, I think, yeah, it is lonely. It's lonely for everyone. We've got to work at it. Don't be afraid, reach out. I've yet to find anyone in lockdown who says, oh, please stop phoning me. I don't want to talk to anyone. Everyone wants to talk and be listened to. So reach out, and even be willing to reach out to people who you don't know very well, but maybe you've got their phone number. Don't be afraid. Reach out. I'll just ring to see how you're doing. That sort of thing is really important. We've got to look after each other.
Thank you. That's a good reminder, actually. Something I should probably work on. Another question for you. Does mental health affect faith?
Yes, this is a really good question. And definitely it will. There is such a thing as spiritual depression. All right. It's different from what we might regard as regular depression in that it's unique to the Christian. It's really only the Christian who worries about their relationship with God. The person who isn't really can't be bothered. And I think worrying about our relationship with God is often a sign that there is spiritual life within us. At the same time, spiritual depression can be very, very debilitating. If you read the book of Psalms, and I personally think if you're a Christian, you should be reading a psalm a day, or at least part of a psalm a day. They're like windows into the soul. They're the different moods of the Christian, so powerfully presented in the book of Psalms, which really is a songbook, but it's full of Christian theology. It's wonderfully helpful. Now, some of those Psalms speak with great honesty, where Christians are actually believing that somehow God has abandoned them or he's rejected them. Something's going on in their life that makes them think like that. So, yeah, sometimes our mental health can distort our view of God. There's a very interesting psalm. It's Psalm 73, I think it is. It's a psalm of Asaph. And he's got himself into a really bad patch. And he says in there that he starts to envy people who were wicked. What's the point of being a Christian? I'm so miserable. My life's all sorts of problems. And he says, when I look at their lives, people who aren't Christians, they just seem to be having a wild time and a wonderful time. And he said, I started to envy them. And there's a lovely phrase in Psalm 73 where it says, all this was oppressive to me. It was really, really getting him down until, he said, I entered the sanctuary of God, place of worship. And entering there, he would have been reminded straight away of the character of God and also the whole business of sacrifice. Two things, the worship of God, who God is, and sacrifice. And he said all of a sudden his thinking came back into line. There are New Testament examples. The Apostle Paul is a remarkable man, great missionary pioneer, terrific adventures, never a dull moment, often in prison and knowing great difficulties, taking the Christian message into massive pagan cities where there were no Christians, having these terrific experiences, but it had an effect on him. So we read, for example, in 2 Corinthians about how he went to one place thinking God had told him to go there and preach the good news about Jesus. And he said, I couldn't stay there because I didn't find my friend Titus there. He needed friendship as an indicator that he was at a low ebb. And actually at the beginning of 2 Corinthians, he speaks about there being a time in his life when he was in Asia, we think he was in Ephesus, where life was so bad, he said, I despaired of life itself. His sense of mental health was clearly affecting him spiritually, as it was back in the Old Testament there with Asaph. So, yeah, we are whole people, you see. We're not just souls, we are embodied souls. And part of that embodiment involves our mental health.
Thank you for that, Phil. Another one for you. Is Christianity any better for mental health than other religions?
Well, I'm biased, aren't I? I've got to be honest. And I'm not a brilliant expert on other religions, all right? I mean, you'll find, for example, some people will say to you things like, oh, Buddhism's the thing. You all hear about mindfulness. And I used to teach relaxation exercises for a living. And we were doing all sorts of things long before the mindfulness craze came along. But, I would bring you back. There are unique things in Christianity. And the biggest thing is this, that God has come into our world and has really experienced what it means to be a human being. And I think that's massive. So it means when I have my own distresses, I know that I'm talking to someone who understands. And that is an amazing thing. He's not some God far away, not a God who's indifferent or something like that, or so mystical and ethereal that we can't relate to him. But he comes to us as one of us, a real man, a real human being. One of the Old Testament prophets, writing many hundreds of years before Jesus was born, said that he would be known as a man of sorrows and familiar with grief. There's no human emotion that he hasn't experienced. In fact, the New Testament tells us that he's experienced every human temptation that we can experience, and yet without sinning. And that's a very profound thing. So yeah, I am biased. I don't know enough about other religions, but I really am biased about Christianity. I think Jesus is just wonderful. I think his life is so compelling. It is so real. And it is he identifies with us in a way that I think genuinely is unique to Christianity.
Well, I might be slightly biased too, but I think that was a very good answer, I do.
Thank you, Dixie.
Good. Another one for you. God commands people not to hurt others. So what does he think of us if we're hurting ourselves?
Well, do you know, in all honesty, the issue of self-harm, of course, is very, very common, isn't it? And people self-harm for different reasons. And do you know what? I honestly think the attitude of God towards somebody who's self-harming is compassion. I think self-harming is an expression of our inward distress. When I was working in the health service, I saw some really quite extraordinary examples of self-harming. And it was always an expression of inward distress. And God's attitude towards us in our hitting the distress of this world. I mentioned way back when I was talking about Jesus that there was an occasion when he cried at a friend's funeral. And it's very interesting that in the words, the language that the New Testament's written originally, which was Koine Greek, it speaks about that moment that he made the noise like the snorting of a horse. He was deeply moved in his spirit when he saw this picture of grief and mourning and distress. And it's the reminder that God is not indifferent to us in our sorrows. He is angry with sin, but he is also filled with compassion to us, caught up in the chaos of the kind of world in which we live, which can sometimes create very powerful, deep, negative things inside of us. So, yeah, we'd all agree self-harming isn't the right thing to do. On a clear day, we'd all agree with that. But I actually think that God is filled with compassion, as it is a symptom and an indicator of the very thing that Jesus died on the cross to free us from.